Hi, everybody. So obviously I'm not here. I told you guys about this. So you should hopefully have your headphones on and you're listening to this lecture, copying it into your guided notes. So obviously this first slide is some of the vocabulary that you guys talked about yesterday, and I just want to go over it really quick with you guys. Again, you should already have this down in your guided notes. One of the things, hopefully, yesterday that you guys got from the station activity that I had you guys do with the Spanish American War was the role of the media and what they played in this war. There's a technique called yellow journalism. It's basically what that means. Yellow journalism is where the media began to kind of over exaggerate events to sell their products. So kind of they used war because back then keep in mind there was no radio, there was no TV back then. So the way that people got their news was by reading the papers, and one of the things that drove up the news and where people would buy the papers is during times of war. More papers were sold during war. So the two leading newspapers at the time, as you guys can see, was Joseph Pulitzer. He owned a newspaper called The World, and William Randolph Hearst owned the New York Journal. Those are both two competing newspapers, and they essentially used the war to increase their sales. And some of the techniques they used to sell papers was by using this yellow journalism technique, where they kind of over exaggerated certain things. In some cases, they just made up some stuff, and they kind of jumped to conclusions before like a true investigation can really be held. Now, again, you try to find parallels to like today and things that happened 100 something years ago to like now. A lot of these things are still going on, in terms of what the media is being accused of, how they drum up news, and how they use propaganda. But the propaganda again is ideas, information that's designed to influence people. So one of the things they did was something called the USS Maine. So as you guys hopefully learned about yesterday, what ended up happening is that once the Spanish the Spanish started, as you guys can see, they started to expel a lot of Cubans from Cuba. They started using concentration camps. They used brutal tactics, and what started happening was that there was U.S. investments that were already in Cuba. We started investing in their sugar plantations. So when all the Spanish started going in there and started using force, we sent in the USS Maine, which was a battleship. We sent a battleship into Havana to basically protect U.S. interests, which was the sugar businesses that we had invested in. So on February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine, there was an explosion on the boat. And on this explosion, it killed over 260 American sailors on this boat. And immediately, as soon as it happened, really without an investigation, the media, Joseph Pulitzer, William Hearst, their newspapers basically pointed the finger at the Spanish for causing this. Um, Hopefully, again, you guys got this from the summit from yesterday, that the Spanish actually probably did not cause this explosion. There was a fire that happened in the bottom part of the ship for coal that heated up explosives and caused the whole ship to burst. However, the next day in the newspapers, the newspapers started pointing the finger at Spain as if they did it. And with that, think about, are Americans going to take that lightly that Americans died and the papers are blaming Spain? They're going to want revenge. So the American public really started to rally behind these newspapers that was implicating Spain for causing this explosion on a U.S. ship that will ultimately kill 260 Americans. And then you also have other things too. General the Butcher Wheeler, he was a Spanish general in Cuba that put a lot of Cubans in concentration camps. And a lot of these atrocities that are going to be talked about are going to be put in American papers. So Americans begin to start to support and start to sympathize with the Cubans, start rallying behind them. That's another reason why a lot of Americans too will also support the war against Spain, because the American media is going to portray them as being savage-like. All right, so Spanish. So this will ultimately lead to the Spanish-American War, also known as the Splendid Little War. The reason why it's called Splendid Little War is because this war was a very short war. It was only about 16 weeks, and obviously splendid is a good thing. So that means the Americans are going to win. Again, this is a short war between the U.S. and Spain. Um, this will really be one of the really first wars that America is going to fight in when we start developing our imperialist attitude. And I know we talked about this in class about how Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean islands, and how we want to start expelling and get rid of the Spanish and French influence. Well, this is going to be one way to do that. So again, the history leading up to the war: Spain controlled Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The Spanish are going to treat the natives very horribly here, and all these atrocities are going to be posted in American media. So this starts to kind of drum roll the beat of the support for American influence to fight against the Spanish, where we start portraying the Spanish as being evil. So, beginning of U.S. imperialism, as I said before, Spain controlled colonies in North America. They controlled Puerto Rico. They controlled Cuba. They controlled the Philippines and Asia. And we saw the Philippines. Again, if you think back to that Pacific map that I showed with Pearl Harbor and Hawaii, the Philippines was what we saw was a key location for us to kind of get into the Asian market. We wanted that because this was an opportunity. It's right at the coast of China, not far away from Japan. Um, so this is a good opportunity. If we can fight Spain and win against Spain, we can control this key market. And again, we could take their people, we could take their resources, we can sell U.S. products. So this is a very good location for us. As I said before, Spanish treatment of natives. General Wheeler put Cubans in camps, killed thousands of Cubans, used them as slave labor. The people of Cuba wanted freedom. Now, again, us as Americans, we can sympathize with that, right? How we wanted our freedom from Great Britain. We were once seen as like the little guy. So a lot of Americans, and this is only about 100 years before the American Revolution, so a lot of Americans really started to feel bad for the Cubans, and this is again one factor in why we're going to support this war against the Spanish. And as I said before, the role of the media, the competition between two major newspapers, Hearst and Pulitzer. Again, they needed to create news. War drove paper sales, so this was a good thing. So again, you see like pictures like this that were put into the media. Again, cartoons were a big drive back then. Wheeler the Butcher, he may serve his country still further. How we wanted to put him in jail for his war crimes. So again, beginning of U.S. imperialism, as is for William Hearst, New York World, Joseph Pulitzer. Both papers told scandalous and over-exaggerated stories called yellow journalism, as I already mentioned a million times. So you guys see right here one example: crisis is at hand, Spanish treachery. Here's a picture of the Maine right here. So this is an example. So notice what yellow journalism is. So you have these big headlines. So this big font, right? It's all in caps. So what they do, they're trying to grab your attention. They use power words like treachery, crisis, and again, they're pointing the finger at Spain for their role in the Maine incident. So they sent reporters to Cuba to cover the story. So again, these stories were not balanced. They only used Cuban sources for their stories to kind of again paint a very negative picture of the Spanish. And again, Hearst, which was the owner of one of the papers, he felt very strongly that the U.S. should intervene in Cuba. So a lot of those stories that he created is going to again start shaping American influence, start shaping American minds to support the Cubans. So once the Maine happened, once the USS Maine exploded, at that point Americans were already ticked off with Spanish. Well, once the Maine exploded, boom, that was kind of like the lightning rod to kind of kickstart it all. All right, so why did we go to war against Spain? Again, really two main reasons. One, the USS Maine explosion. Again, most Americans did not like Spain already because of the stories that were printed already. But then once the Maine happened, boom, that was kind of like the last straw. 260 Americans in the Navy are going to die. U.S. is going to blame Spain, as you guys see here. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of enemy. Again, all caps, power words, destruction. So that's again one reason. And the second reason was that we did not talk about yesterday in the thing was the Delome letter. Who was Delome? Delome was a Spanish prime minister, and he wrote a letter, and this letter got intercepted. It got intercepted, and basically in this letter, it called the American president, President McKinley, weak. And so this was like again the last straw in terms of President McKinley, because President McKinley really didn't want to go to war. But then you got Spain calling you weak, kind of calling you out. Now this letter that was intercepted wasn't necessarily meant for the United States, but when it came out, what was said in it and how they viewed McKinley, it basically forced him to take action, which was to declare war. So this led to the Spanish-American War. So really in two fronts, we fight in two different areas. We fight in the Philippines. This was from May to August of 1898. So again, relatively short, about 3 months. May, June, July, and ended in August. So the leader that was in charge of this of the Navy at the time, the assistant secretary, was Teddy Roosevelt. We talked about him, right? He was the first progressive. This was before his political career. He sends out U.S. fleet to the Philippines in case war were to break out. And eventually the war will break out between Spain and the Filipino rebels. The U.S. is going to destroy the Spanish naval fleet, and it will ultimately lead to Spain's surrender in the Philippines. So once they surrender, we're going to acquire, which we'll talk more about tomorrow, we're going to acquire the Philippines from Spain. We're going to pay them money to acquire that location, to get into the Asian market. And then Cuba. The other front was in Cuba. Again, this is off the coast of Florida. Again, you see Teddy Roosevelt here. U.S. is going to send a naval blockade of Cuba. Now, a lot of the troops that fought in this war for the United States are going to be really ill-prepared and ill-equipped. Most of the soldiers that we have in this war are going to be volunteer soldiers. They're not professional. There's really not enough guns, supplies to go around. They have wool uniforms. Think about Cuba; it's very hot, so wool is going to be will not be a very popular fashion part with the soldiers. But ultimately, one of the heroes of the war was a group called the Rough Riders. And this group was personally led by Teddy Roosevelt. Again, he wanted to be on that front line, so he kind of stepped behind his desk. He got out of that desk role, and he wanted to lead this volunteer group called the Rough Riders. And ultimately, the reason why essentially this group is, I guess, more well known is because they charged up San Juan Hill. At the top, you had Spain that was part up there, so they charged up the hill and they cleared the hill and basically forced the Spanish surrender. So this is a very, again, if you guys know war tactics, being on top of the hill, you have better position over your enemy. Well, Teddy Roosevelt led this group up the hill through a very valiant and brave effort and got them to retreat. And this is really a big deal in terms of the outcome of the war by forcing them to retreat here. So Teddy Roosevelt comes home a war hero. And then finally, you have the Spanish-American War, the Treaty of Paris, 1898. After 16 weeks of fighting, this was the cost. About 5,400 Americans died. 379 died in battle. The rest died from disease. And then the terms of the treaty that was signed, Cuba was to be independent. However, I put independent kind of in air quotes. A couple things. The U.S. made them sign up the Platt Amendment, which basically will give the U.S. the ability to set up military bases. So if you ever heard of Guantanamo Bay, this was a base that was set up that we acquired land in Cuba. So essentially, we kind of not fully take them over, but we have influence in Cuba after Spain leaves. The U.S. will also get Puerto Rico and Guam. So this is kind of where we get a lot of our influence in Puerto Rico and Guam is after this war. And as I said before, the U.S. is going to pay $20 million to get the Philippines from Spain. And then finally, you have the Panama Canal, U.S. imperialism in Latin America. So what you guys are going to do, I know we have about 30 seconds left in this video. What you guys are going to do is that you are going to go and watch an Ed puzzle about the Panama Canal. It's about 8-9 minutes, so you should have no problem finishing this before the period. So guys, you have this, which is 15 minutes. Ed puzzle is 8. There's no reason why you can't finish that in 40 minutes. So make sure that you watch that. You guys can see by the map here. You guys see that this is a way for us to cut through right here where my cursor is. So Panama is right there. This will allow us to build a canal to cut through our ships to get to the west coast. So you guys will read about that in the Ed Puzzle. And after you're done with the Ed Puzzle, there's a reading that I posted in Google Classroom. So please read that by tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.